At the end of the 8th century, a wave of terrifying violence hit the coastal settlements of northern Europe. Viking raids. They plundered, they killed indiscriminately, and with each attack, the stories grew.
It was as though the gates of hell had been thrown open.
Their leaders were legendary, even in their own time. Ivar the Boneless, Eric the Red, Harold Bluetooth. Men who made their names through savagery. Our investigators are setting out to discover the world they lived in. They'll build a picture of a culture steeped in bloodshed and yet highly sophisticated. They'll reconstruct the ruined fortress of Harold Bluetooth, first king of all the Vikings. They'll find the hidden traces of a warlord city buried beneath modern streets. And they'll examine the key piece of technology that set the Vikings apart from all other forces.
With these longships, the Vikings were able to redraw the map of Europe.
Ships like these took Viking explorers like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson further than anyone had ever gone before. Using the latest research and graphic technology, we will rebuild an extraordinary civilization and bring back the lost world of the Vikings. Killers, bandits, barbarians, pagans. Though the Viking culture died out more than 1,000 years ago, its reputation lives. Investigators Jonathan Foyle and Helena Hamerow want to uncover the truth about these extraordinary warriors and the world they came from. Helena Hamerow is an archaeologist from the University of Oxford and studies Europe's ancient cultures.
One of the genuine great mysteries about this period is why the Vikings emerged when they did. What made them suddenly want to raid and ultimately colonize in the way that they did?
Jonathan Foyle is an architectural historian. He decodes buildings as a way of understanding the cultures that produced them.
Part of the Viking experience is living with the raw materials, the earth and the fire and the wind and the water. They're very much people who live with the elements.
Historians put a precise date on when the Viking campaign of terror started, 793 AD. They began with an act of devastating sacrilege. Jonathan has traveled to Lindisfarne on the coast of northeastern England. A monastery stood here, in its time, one of Christianity's most sacred and celebrated shrines.
We've inherited a picture of the Vikings as being bloodthirsty, savage pirates. And that reputation was born here at Lindisfarne.
Word of what the Vikings did here would spread quickly throughout Europe. Richard Oram explains.
This is the first attack on a major centre. This is the place where all hell is let loose for the first time. And psychologically, this was the one that pushed people across the edge into believing that apocalypse was on them.
The attack was a surprise. The first anyone knew of the Vikings was when their longships appeared on the horizon. And for the monks of the monastery, the very idea that their sanctuary should be attacked was beyond belief. Yet as Jonathan finds out, it's clear the Vikings knew exactly what they were doing.
So what's in it for the Vikings?
Loot. Movable wealth to start with, all the nice bits of blingy metalwork and things like that. But they're also after slaves. Slaves are a great commodity.
The monastery was famed for its relics and its treasures. Its only protection was faith, the belief that no one would dare desecrate holy ground.
They don't have defences. This is a monastery.
So presumably they have a wall or something around the monastic enclosure, something maybe like that.
They've got, yes, a boundary that runs round the whole place. It marks out the sacred space on the interior from the world outside. But it's really just a sort of a demarcation line.
Climbing to the highest point on the island, Jonathan and Richard try to build a picture of the community that the Vikings set about destroying.
What would the Vikings have seen here well over 1,000 years ago?
Well, absolutely nothing like this. None of the stone buildings that you see now, nothing at all of that kind. And of course, there's no other houses here. This is a monastic community. But where you've got the parish church across there and the priory church here, this would have been the site of the monastery sacked by the Vikings. But instead of stone buildings, think mainly of timber.
And this is how the simple wooden structures of Lindisfarne would have looked on that day in 793. A model of Christian simplicity, these modest buildings nevertheless contained a treasure trove of riches, making them a perfect target for the heathen Vikings.
Is a place that's poorly defended, made of flammable material, and it wouldn't have taken much effort for the Vikings 3 or 4 or 5 shiploads of men with axes to come and take apart this entire
Absolutely
monastery.
not. I mean, there's nothing here to resist them, and if they had a will to destroy it, they could have easily just razed it from the face of the earth.
Viking attacks were fast. Approach at speed, then strike, kill, plunder, and burn. Lindisfarne was left in flames, and the blueprint for a Viking raid was set.
The monk Alcuin, who's at the emperor's court over in Europe, is writing letters of condolence. He's heard about the terrible things that have happened here, and so basically it gets put down in the written record, and that fixes it for all time as the great event.
And what's their opinion of these fair-haired strangers that cause them so much damage? And they must have been petrified.
Oh, basically they're just looking on them as the hordes of Antichrist. This is a pagan force. They're slaughtering God's men. They're utterly barbaric. They are ruthless, bloodthirsty killers.
The Lindisfarne raid was the first of many. But where did the Vikings come from? Where did they return with their spoils? Archaeologist Helena Hammero is in the Swedish capital, Stockholm, on the trail of the looted Christian relics that came from Lindisfarne and elsewhere. She wants to find out about the Viking homeland and the culture that produced such savagery. At the National Museum, she meets with curator Kent Anderson to see the loot for herself.
We have, well, quite a lot of objects. Objects from the Arabic world, there, Western European objects.
How did they get to Sweden?
If we have unique objects, or if they come from a very special context, like a church or monastery or something like that, then you would think that it would be plunder. That is also a unique object, and that must have been a result of plunder.
It looks suspiciously like the top of a bishop's crozier.
Yeah, it is.
So do we have to imagine that some poor Irish bishop was mugged and his crozier taken from him?
Yes, like some sort of souvenir.
This sacred symbol of a bishop's authority stands in stark contrast to many of the other finds. Among the museum's most prized possessions are numerous swords. The most prestigious of all Viking weapons, the blade of a longsword could be worth as many as 16 dairy cows. A sword-wielding warrior was a man of the highest status. Behind the scenes at the museum, Kent shows Helena more disturbing archaeological remains. Evidence of not just animal, but human sacrifice.
This is part of a skull and skeletons. A grave containing 3 individuals, 2 of them with their head chopped off. So they must have been human sacrifice.
How do we know they were sacrificed?
You could see it, yeah, you could see it on the bones, actually.
So we have sort of cut marks
Yeah.
on the vertebrae.
Yeah.
Good heavens. Human sacrifice obviously would have been quite a sort of shocking practice to the early Christian world.
it must have
this
been.
is obviously suggestive of quite a different kind of ideology and worldview. And why did it occur? I mean, were these people criminals, or had they done something wrong? Were they being punished, or?
No, I don't think so. That was the highest offering you could give the gods.
So if you wanted to go one better than a horse or a cow, you would actually sacrifice maybe a slave or...
Yes.
Human sacrifices were part of the burial of a great warrior or chief. Much of what we know